I currently run Outerker, which is Microsoft's open source foundation. I used to be head of legacy engineering, paid services engineering, SVP at AOL. Thank you. And I'm going to build on some of what Ken said about OpenStack as I go through. Can everyone in the back hear me? Now, how's that? That's the problem with being software. Words and meetings, people have to be very intent. They have to stay intent. All right, so I'm going to talk a bit in this session about business strategies surrounding open source. Raise your hand in here if you're an engineer. Okay, great, engineer to me. Okay, so I think there's probably a pretty good understanding of open source as a technology course, and I'm going to go back and talk a little bit about the business aspects. And to begin to talk about it, I'm going to bring everybody back a way back to Chile for a minute here, back to 1998. Everybody here was born after 1998, right? Okay, excellent. That's always happened lately. So back in 1998, there was a team of people that met for the first OSI meeting. And one of the things they meant to do was to establish a definition around open source, the open source initiative. And here's a direct quote from PR release that the team put out at the time. And one of the things that I find interesting about going back and reviewing this is that it's clear that the original definitions around open source arose not out of engineering need or engineering philosophies, but out of business need. Netscape had just found a way to release their code in an open source fashion, not to derive engineering advantages, but specifically to disadvantage Microsoft and Internet Explorer. And it worked incredibly well. But while the beginning of OSS was firmly grounded in business strategy, over the last 10, 15 years or so, most of the discussions around open source software have been, particularly inside companies, have been around open source software and open source strategies as engineering practices. And most of those conversations have been about how do you build projects in an open source fashion. But that's changing because right now, we've reached an inflection point here. OpenStack is a great example of this. And that the biggest software projects that are being built today are not being built inside big software companies. Up until a relatively recent point in time, if you really wanted to build an enormous engineering project, you were going to build it inside a company. It was going to be built within IBM. It was going to be built within Microsoft. You were going to build a company the size of Google, or you're going to build a company the size of Amazon in order to tackle these large engineering problems and to bring really big, complex projects to market. But this is changing. And a lot of the reason that this is changing is because of Android. When Android was released for a very similar reason that Netscape was originally released as an open source project. It was released by Google specifically to disrupt how Microsoft was bringing its enterprise software packages to market. And it has worked out incredibly well. Android, I think we're all quite familiar at this point, is probably the most popular, people debate this, again, Microsoft's open source foundation. Probably the most highly adopted tablet OS available right now. And this has made people sit up and notice. Interestingly, among the companies that have sat up and reconsidered their strategy because of Android is Google. There are people now within Google that are like, that's awesome, glad everybody's using them, why aren't we making more money? And so they're working right now to change some of their contribution agreements and some of their business partnership agreements around Android to see if they can recoup some of that business advantage, some of that strategic business advantage back specifically to Google. Because they're looking over places like Amazon and Kindle and Kindle's building a core version of Android, and they're like, maybe we should rethink the strategy of it. It's still, of course, going to remain open source. And it's interesting to see the Android circle, Android story in the open circle. One of the reasons that open source software really began to take off was that it was very easy for individuals to figure out how to make contributions to large software projects. It was easy for them to figure out how, relative to their own skill sets, relative to the time they had available, relative to the projects they were interested in, they could find a way to contribute. And this is where open source software really started to win. So open source software provides high levels of satisfaction for contributors. It allows developers to scratch their own itch. They didn't have to go to work for a big company or to solve a problem for themselves. But the thing that really interests me about open source software, and the thing that got me interested in it from the beginning, is the fact that open source software allows for economically efficient collaboration. Probably not a lot of people in the room who work for a really big software company. But when you work for a big software company, the amount of time you spend having to go around and knock door to door to door to door to door to get people to collaborate with you completely outstrips the amount of time you really spend coding. There's a really good example that I've been using over the last year or so, where I was doing some consulting, I was working for a client. The client had 27 different business units, and I had this engineer assigned to me to figure out how to get all 27 business units together line behind the project. It took him probably 4 hours to write the code for the project. It took him another 3 hours to debug it himself, work beautifully, and it took us 4 months to launch that. And the first week, we went around and we met with 1 hour for the head of every single business unit that we had to meet with. And we met with that business unit's superintendent. And we had to meet with that business unit's product manager. And we had to meet with that product manager's engineering counterpart. There was some whiskey involved in order to get various people to take our meetings. And at one point, this engineer turned around to me in complete and utter frustration, because we had a close tally of the number of hours we were putting into this. And he was so frustrated at the amount of time that was spent managing around this corporation to just get this code launched that he had written. And I pointed out that when you're working across a really big company, that's what it takes to get things done. And that when you want to launch things, it's not just about opening code, it's not just about debugging the code, it's about figuring out how to take advantage of the distribution systems, for example, associated with that company, and managing through all the different channels that are on that. This doesn't happen with open source software. It's a great example of OpenStack. You go to OpenStack, you write the code, you show up on your two sites, you get a change pushed through, and it goes live. And from an engineering perspective, that is far more satisfying than having to go to more and The rise of social media has also driven changes in how people operate within the open source communities. If you go back 10 or 15 years ago, certainly if you go back to 1998, which now is almost 16 years ago, it was relatively difficult to figure out how to collaborate between different people. You could join mailing lists, for example. It took some time to work your way through. It still took a little bit of time to find the people you were looking for. And social media, Twitter particularly, has completely leveled that. I get phone calls, I get reached out to. People know how to track me down in a way that they couldn't easily 10, 15 years ago. When I want to get something done, I go to LinkedIn. And it's very, very easy for me to figure out who I have to get in touch with in order to get something to me forward. And the great level of the role, of course, is GitHub. GitHub has completely shifted how people operate inside corporations and between corporations. I assume everybody in here is using GitHub for at least one project. Great. This has completely challenged the notion of how companies not only build software, but how they distribute software. If you think about how a company is organized and arranged, company is organized specifically to take on ever larger projects. When I first went to work at Microsoft, there was a guy I worked for, really smart guy, his name's Mike Duconi. He was the original architect for .NET. And he used to say to me, you have to figure out how to make the size of this company work for you. And for a long time, I internalized that as, you have to make this place act like a startup. And I worked with some startups, and built and sold it. But it took me a long time to realize that what he was saying was something different. What he was trying to explain to me is that if you want to take something on for Microsoft, it has to be big enough to justify the investment of other people making a new project. It has to be big enough to convince an entire department of 3,000 or 7,000 or an entire division of 30,000 people to take your project on. So if you're within a company the size of Microsoft, it really isn't economically efficient to take on those small projects and are efficient to take on their startup. There's actually some very interesting economic theory around this. Anybody wants to read it? Written by Richard Coates. And hit me up afterward if you want me to point it to you. So all these companies are arranged. They've got these huge engineering teams. They've got these huge marketing teams. They've got these huge business development teams. And all of a sudden, you can get something to market without all those engineers. You get something to market without all those program managers coordinating communication between those engineers. And without all those business development people, or marketing people. And OpenStack, again, is a great example of that. And what these big companies are realizing is that engaging with the open source community allows them to scale projects in a way that they've never been able to do before. It's allowed them to influence and access engineering resources that are outside their specific control. And in addition to allowing them to take advantage of their engineering communities, they can take advantage of business communities as well. So, again, going back a little bit, as they take on these bigger and smaller projects, if you go back to, say, the period of time from roughly 1998 to roughly 2010, if you're an engineer, you're discovering through that timeline that you don't have to go to the business person and say, hey, can you set up a relationship with, say, Google? If you get somebody who wants to give me access to your API, you find that live documentation, you just set up a relationship via the API. There's never a business person involved. If you want to build a website, back then, if you want to build a website, you want to integrate owner information, you don't have to call this person on your team and say, hey, can you get in touch with somebody and ask you whether you have a channel. You just go out and find the documentation and you write the code. Now, this was a big change for most big technology companies. What open source software is doing today is replacing that relationship even further. So that engineering teams can not only open up really fine interfaces between one another, they can let each other collaborate and contribute to each other's code and the long-term projects and long-term strategic initiatives being taken on between various companies. Does this make sense to folks? And what we have now looks a lot more like this. We've got ants sort of hurtling off a cliff, trying to figure out how to work together. Does anybody know what ants make these little bridges, by the way? So what they do is they run to the edge of the cliff and they throw each other off. Some of the ants fall through, but they throw enough ants off that eventually ants catch legs and they start to build these bridges across between one another. And that's basically what's happening right now with big technology companies. It's important to realize that right now it's very attractive. OpenStack's a great example. There's another big collaborative project. I keep coming back to OpenStack because Ken just talked about it. I know they're probably in here as well. But the thing to remember is that open source software is not immune to the limits of managing its ecosystem. That there's developing a new set of problems that haven't been addressed or tackled before from the business side. If, for example, you go back to that period of time where you go to a biz dev person who negotiate a relationship for you, that biz dev person would be thinking about what are the long-term goals of my company, how am I going to make money on this project, how is my partner going to make money on this project, and before you open up access to those APIs, all those business issues will be worked out. When you get to a project like OpenStack, then you've got all these companies, all these engineers involved, and there are places where those issues have not yet been worked out. And this is a place where there's ground to be gained and understanding from a business perspective how you can contribute to the development of a much more effective economic system overall. We go back again to 1998, the rules of open source software as an engineering practice were very well established. Like the slide code. My son was born in 1998 too, so sometimes I use his baby pictures. He was actually the first baby born to somebody working at Amazon. Some people see him now 6 feet tall to measure how much time has gone by since then. The rules were set back in 1998, very clear. They make the source code available, contributions and fixes need to be integrated into the source code. I think we all know it's good by crafting, etc. What's notable is that these are not rules around business relationships. These are rules around business practices. And it's just now that people are starting to get around thinking about what does it mean for two companies to be looking to achieve their business goals relative to their engineering goals. So OpenStack, for example, I think this is a little bit updated. At OpenStack, we've got 9,500, I think it's now 12,000 members, 15,000. Okay, great, it's not a lot since Christmas time. We've got 15,000 members from all around the world, and it's now secured, I think, close to $20 million in funding. It's well over $10 million, that's $20 million for the year. And OpenStack was put together to provide an alternate source to the dominant players at the time for AWS and Azure, Microsoft's investments in Azure. And the OpenStack teams came together, their strategic vision, the ability to execute on it, and understanding how they wanted to organize their contributions. And they also decided to make themselves open source, of course. And one of the things that the team leading OpenStack very early realized was that all the efforts they were putting together in organizing engineers were going to be completely lost if they didn't find a way to be wholly competitive against the offerings coming out of AWS and Azure and now Google. And so this really marched the watershed moment. So Android, for example, is a really big project. Android was put out there with an intent to disrupt Windows, work well enough. But this is the first time that it's even thought we have to think about the strategic imperatives from a business perspective of our putting all this time and effort into this project. So one of the first places where this became an issue was around the set of APIs that the OpenStack team was developing. And between the two meetings in the March of 2013 and the one coming up this May, one of the issues that had to be decided were what were the interfaces that were going to be exposed from OpenStack into the marketplace. And there were two paths that the team could have gone down. And there was a lot of discussion, there was a lot of debate internally about which path to pick. And there were some people who wanted to establish a separate set of standards, and there were some people who wanted to just assume the standard, assume Amazon interfaces to be the standard. So while there were engineering arguments being made in either direction about which of those interfaces were in fact from an engineering perspective the better interfaces, but the real debate here wasn't an engineering debate. It was, do we want to try and establish our own standard and therefore make it harder later on for people to switch off of OpenStack, or do we want to view Amazon and AWS as the de facto standards and make it easier for people to switch into OpenStack? After a lot of debate, the decision was made to adopt the Amazon interfaces as the standards for OpenStack. And this is really the first example of a large open source project treating itself as a large platform across which other people could begin to work and to build. It's the first time, in my understanding, in my view of open source history, that a really big open source project has taken an offensive attack on its strategy and not just a defensive attack on its strategy. Open source projects themselves are getting much, much bigger, and they now are in a position that they're no longer being built in response to an existing project, but they're developing themselves as their own genuine independent platforms with their own genuine independent ecosystems. And what I mean by that is that, and here I'm going well beyond the age of almost everybody in the room, but if you go back 25, 30 years to when Unix was the dominant operating system, and then Windows came along with top of Unix, and then Linux came along in response to Windows. They were all being developed from a very specific perspective. If you were an application developer, developer, for example, in the 1990s to 1992, you couldn't just develop an application easily. You had to think about what was happening right down in the middle, inside every box in which that application was going to be running, and every version of every box in which that application was going to be running. The early operating systems were developed to abstract out that complexity and allow developers who were purely about building those applications. Linux was a direct response to the fact that Windows was gaining prominence amongst consumers and locking out, in some people's minds, non-innovation. Android was developed, Android was purposely grown specifically to disrupt Windows Mobile or any attempt of Microsoft to establish on Windows and on mobile devices. We're now hitting a point where open source projects themselves are being developed and expected to hold their own in the marketplace. And what we're seeing is that the enterprise companies are suddenly finding this to be a really attractive proposition. And their response to these big open source projects is very, very different. The response, for example, on the part of Amazon to OpenStack, very different than how enterprise companies have viewed open source projects in the past. And this means that open source projects have to be, particularly ones at scale, really big projects, have to be much more thoughtful about how they're competing in the marketplace. Because big enterprise companies are going after those projects. And not only are they going after those projects, but they're going after them and adopting the same mechanisms, the same development mechanisms, the same economic efficiency and partnerships that are seen and enjoyed within open source projects themselves. So the rules that were set in 1998 are no longer enough. Open source software needs to again respond strategically. Just as in 1998, when the original project rules were established in order to get Netscape out in the market successfully, the open source software industry itself needs now to step back and say, how do we really compete? Not merely as an engineering mechanism, as a way to get software built, but as a way to get the test products built and competitively launched and maintained in the marketplace. While all this is going on, there's a lot of pressure coming in from the platform. You can't really get through an engineering discussion right now on the enterprise level without talking about the cloud. So I'm not going to talk specifically about space, but I'll go on that space. We're at a point in time right now where CIOs at all the major companies are examining their engineering practices. They're realizing it's no longer efficient to maintain this group of boxes. They're examining their cloud alternatives, and while they're doing that, they're completely examining their IT purchase practices. And this is the point where everybody from really big banks to really small retailers in some cases are saying, do I still have to pay all this money for enterprise software licenses, or is it finally viable for me to look at open source systems and open source solutions? And this is the great set of problems right now, which faces the open source community. If you go back over the last 10, 15, 20 years, and you've grown up as a technology executive in that period of time, one of the things you've gotten really good at is knowing what your needs are and then negotiating with a really big enterprise software company to fill those needs. And so the salesperson shows up, and then somebody else shows up with software that's installed for you, everything works together great, you never have to worry about it again. But if we're thinking about using open source software and open source solutions, either adopting wholesale solutions or simply adopting frameworks and libraries to help your developers' lives easier, suddenly you have to think about integration, and you have to think about support, and you have to think about compatibility in a way that you have really not had to over the last 15 to 20 years. So I believe the next great challenge for the open source software community, especially now that all these enterprise companies are viewing them as a competitive threat, is finding a way to not only work collaboratively to develop and build their software, but finding a way to collaborate in these business practices as well, and make this compilation of open source solutions as attractive as being utilized by enterprise software. It's really no longer enough for you to go out there and develop something on your own. You're going to be out there, protected, it's cold, it's lonely, it looks like March in Albany. Somebody who's in Napa, make yourself part of the forest around you and develop that healthy ecosystem around you to allow yourself to be competitive. The quote that I always go back to when I'm trying to think about how I operate from an open source perspective is one by Lewis Thomas in a book called Rise and Sell, where he talks about how the organizing principles of organic systems. And I encourage all of you who are here today with an interest in open source software to look beyond simply how you're developing this as engineers and think about how you reach out to your friends and patrons in the business world, how you think about reaching out to other business owners around you, and finding a way to bring them into these conversations that will allow you not only to make potentially better products, with that better user information, but it will allow you to be more competitive when you push these things out to them. Questions? Yes.
For a moment, I was hoping that you could speak about your experience as a woman in the field of technology.
So, nobody's ever asked me that as the first question. I tend to avoid this question like the plague. And lately, I've changed this. And actually, please help me change this, as a matter of fact. Yes, thank you. Nice technology. The reason I try to avoid this question is that I found in the past that answering this question pigeonholes me and turns the conversation into being about the woman in engineering and away from conversation about engineering itself. But I realized that I am in a position as a senior person in engineering to be able to talk to that question. For me personally, it's not an issue. I have little kids. I've grown up in the engineering community. I've grown up in the engineering community. It's not something that I really think about on a day-to-day basis. But I will say that as somebody who builds consumer-facing products, I've developed a belief over the last 5 to 7 years that I can't bring great competitive products to marketplace if my entire team is exactly the same. And that goes not only for making sure that I have gender diversity in my teams, but making sure I have diversity in everything from geographic background. I can't build worldwide products if all I have is people from China or people from the US. All the way over to making sure that I'm bringing people from different economic backgrounds. I just need to get a little better connect with the audience, and that means that I need to have a lot of different people on my team. Hopefully this is satisfying.
No, thank you.
Yes.
What are the biggest challenges or obstacles you're
One of the biggest challenges and obstacles for growth of the open source movement. Up until I would have thought that one of the big obstacles to the open source movement would have been the organizing power of really great companies running the marketplace when they decide to bring something to market. For example, Amazon decided to bring AWS to market. They were able to coordinate not only their engineering resources, but they were also able to coordinate all the biz dev, marketing, and stuff. And there's an enormous amount of vitality that goes along with that, and money. But what I've seen in the open source community over the last 6 to 12 months particularly is an ability and willingness to engage in almost mimicking the value of a really great company brings to bear. So I think now where the problem is shifted to is how do you get user requirements into open source communities and into open source projects? Open source projects typically are class engineers who want to scratch their own itch. They want to build things that impact people as engineers. One of the reasons that product managers arose, product management as a discipline, arose in technology companies, is somebody has to be thinking about the user. You really want to build something that's viable in the long term. Somebody has to be thinking about how to connect with the user. So finding a way to surface user desires and user requests into open source communities, I think is the next great hurdle to solve. And if open source communities aren't able to solve that problem, then really good companies or staff of product managers who know how to talk to engineers are going to identify and solve those user problems first and build businesses that almost, very difficult, if not completely shut out open source companies. But I've never been asked that before. So
is it that your company does, actually?
Man, one after the other, all the questions I wasn't thinking for.
Sorry.
That's how I work. And so I run OuterCurve, which is Microsoft's open source foundation. And OuterCurve was set up specifically to increase intra-industry collaboration. So it's really, really hard if you're a big software company to collaborate with other big software companies. There's everything from social and cultural reasons. Google engineers are not like Microsoft engineers. It's really hard to get in the other room. I worked on a Microsoft Yahoo implementation. One of the hardest things we had to solve for in that implementation was how do I get Yahoo engineers and Microsoft engineers work really well together. And there's also some legal implications to large software companies working together. So OuterCurve provides a safe home to be able to have those conversations, have those collaborations, and work jointly to bring things to marketplace. In a way that works well for the consumer, whether it's an enterprise consumer or an individual consumer, and is not anti-competitive. The other thing we're starting to do really, really well, and this has just happened for us in the last 6 months or so, is to establish very strong partnerships within academic communities, which you guys actually helped a lot when I came to talk to you guys about 2 months ago. And one of the things that we identified back in Q4 last year, so Christmas quarter, is that it's hard for academic communities to be able to coordinate amongst one another on large open source projects, particularly when we're trying to do that in enterprises. So we recently started solving that problem as well.
So it's kind of like a mediator kind of.
Yeah, it's a mediator, it's a shell.
Yeah.
I did some great design reviews, for example, in January and February. I did 5 design reviews. I did media and advertising, I did banking, I did small businesses, I did academics and financial services. And I was able to get architects together from within really big companies. They were all able to sit down and have lunch. They were able to talk through the technical issues they were facing, both open source and non-open source. And they were able to collaborate towards solutions. It's really hard when you're working inside a company, you find ways to find opportunities to do that. So we facilitate that. Thanks. Yes.
You practically open source your business, but not implementation of a free-based institution.
So when I try and explain open source to business people, what are the 3 best things I mention and the 3 best things I hear from them?
But you couldn't use device or explain open source.
Okay. So the first thing I said, in some cases, is open source is not Linux. You'd be shocked at the number of business people who still think that open source equals Linux, is Linux. Conversation I over and over again. The second thing that I always knock down is there's still this assumption within business divisions, within technical and non-technical companies, that open source equals free. And that if their engineering teams will contribute to or release something as open source, then somehow we're going to have an opportunity for revenue. So usually in those cases, I walk through use cases and business studies. Sugar CRM is one of my very favorites. Nobody ever complains about it. It looks at any of these terms, but it's a fantastic example. Red Hat is also a very, very good example. So pull those up. And then last, the conversations tend to revolve around the degree to which engaging in open source projects allows companies to identify and include engineering talent. There's not a business person out there right now. You're in healthcare, or in financial services, you're working for a software company who doesn't understand how hard it is to identify and create and keep engineering talent. And those conversations around open source being a mechanism for achieving those goals have been very fruitful. Anybody else? Yes.
I guess following through on your answer number 2, how do you, what specifics would you offer a company to convince its people that they can profit from
Well, there's a really good case study that I can speak to. It's a company called Rare Products, and they're an advertising technology company. And I did some design reviews with them last week, and I convinced them to become an open source company. And the reasons I convinced them to become an open source company, the reasons that they responded to were that by opening up the source code, it made it easier for for potential partners, licensing partners, to be able to review their code and to see that the code is of high enough quality that their potential business partners were willing to be doing for engineers. The second thing, this was a kind of a surprise to me, and this proved to be very valuable for them, is that if you're a startup and you're trying to get people to partner with you and choose your services, and your services provided by a big enterprise company, it used to be you had to agree to give them access to your source code, but now you can just say, look, it's an open source license, we're not able to provide all the service you want, or if you don't have money, or a business, you can still have access to your source code. And that was a lot of the perspective of this, and really on the last side. The argument that I make with enterprise companies that resonates is that as an enterprise software company today, or an enterprise technology company today, where you want to compete, and one of the highest margins frankly are right now, is around the services associated with your software. And if you can reduce the cost of getting your software to market by having more people contribute to it, if you can increase the level of market-driven innovation by allowing people in the marketplace to contribute features that they need, which points directly to how features that other people need, it means you have a better product. And it means you can charge consulting services and consulting fees around the product itself. It's very effective.
The main point is that by giving up the revenue stream to the licensing fees, one would increase the revenue stream due to more providing of services.
Actually, slightly different than that. You don't have to give up access to the licensing fees associated with software. And here's the example I use for that. Probably everybody in the room buys pop. You call it on the East Coast? Soda. Everybody in the room buys soda, right? Everybody in the room buys Pepsi or Coca-Cola. The recipe for Pepsi and Coca-Cola are both available online. There's not a person in this room who's going to go out this weekend and make soda instead of just buying soda. And that's the same for technology companies, businesses overall. Many of them would rather pay somebody else for software they know is working, is compatible with other systems they have, and go ahead and do the thing themselves. So even if you've got the code out there, it doesn't mean that someone's going to go through the payment of QA if you want some service, implementing on their own. You're just going to pay for the install. You're going to pay for the license. And it's surprising in other cases.
So in order to use the software effectively, customer must pay for the service.
They don't have to. They can always go out and we can find a project they do that.
Sure, I meant from the customer's point of view, to use the product effectively. The customer makes the judgment that it's more efficient for the customer to provide a service than the customer to take the software and build the service.
Yeah, they're just going to slap down their Amex card and get out on a service basis, and they're just going to work